There comes a point in the life of a deeply sensitive person when something within them grows quiet. Not shattered, not resentful, just finished with a certain way of being. Carl Jung observed that this state is often misunderstood. It is not depression nor simple burnout. It is a profound internal shift, a psychological turning point. To outsiders, it can feel unsettling, even frightening, because when such a person withdraws their emotional investment, they do not become harsh. They become distant in a way that cannot be easily reached or influenced. Jung spent years studying individuals who arrived at this threshold. What he uncovered challenges many common ideas about empathy and transformation. This quiet detachment is not an ending, but the beginning of a deeper evolution. However, to understand this shift, one must first see what brings a person there. He noticed a pattern among those who felt everything intensely. These were not people who occasionally cared too much. They were individuals whose entire being functioned like a receiver for the emotional states of others. The moment they entered a space, they could sense tension, conflict, or unspoken discomfort. Family gatherings drained them, not because of what was said, but because of everything that wasn't. Friendships became heavy because they carried both sides of emotional burdens. In relationships, they often suffered deeply, feeling their partner's pain more strongly than the partner themselves. Jung described such individuals as emotional stabilizers within their environments. They didn't merely understand suffering, they absorbed it, processed it, and often softened it so others could continue without disruption. Over time, this role became expected of them. Family members leaned on them without awareness. Friends sought them out only in distress. Partners unconsciously relied on them for emotional regulation. What made this pattern more complex was that these individuals rarely resisted it. They believed their sensitivity had a purpose, that it was meant to help others. Their exhaustion became a quiet proof of their goodness. The more they sacrificed, the more they felt they were fulfilling who they were meant to be. This belief didn't appear suddenly. It was shaped over years. As children, they were praised for being understanding, for calming situations, for putting others first. Each time they ignored their own needs, they were rewarded with approval. Each time they prevented conflict, they were seen as wise beyond their age. Gradually, self-neglect began to feel like a form of virtue. Yet beneath this outward compassion, something deeper was taking place. Jung noticed that their unconscious mind was not passive. It was observing, recording, and recognizing patterns. Every instance of being used, every subtle manipulation, every emotional imbalance, it was all being quietly documented. Imagine someone who spent years navigating a complicated family dynamic. They could predict reactions before they happened. They knew which words would trigger guilt, which behaviors would deflect responsibility, and how conflicts would unfold before they even began. Their understanding of human behavior became precise, almost instinctive, and yet despite this awareness, they chose not to use it against others. They did not manipulate, expose, or retaliate. They continued to respond with patience, even when they clearly saw the patterns at play. This is where the real tension builds, not in what they feel, but in what they continue to tolerate, even after they fully understand it. They continued to absorb, to care, to give, long after it had begun to cost them something essential. Over time, their awareness became an intricate map of everyone else's emotional patterns, while their own needs were quietly buried beneath obligation and sacrifice. Carl Jung recognized in this a subtle but dangerous division within the psyche. On the surface, these individuals appeared composed, even fulfilled in their role as caretakers. But beneath that calm exterior, something heavier was forming. Not a loud, conscious resentment, but a silent accumulation, like pressure building in a sealed space. It did not express itself openly. Instead, it slowly distorted their sense of self. The turning point, Jung observed, rarely came from small disappointments. It came from something deeper, an undeniable betrayal. Not from strangers, but from those they had supported without hesitation, people they had defended, protected, and believed in. Again and again, the pattern revealed itself. A partner's betrayal after years of emotional dependence, a parent's hidden criticism after a lifetime of quiet loyalty, a friend's dishonesty after receiving unwavering support. What made these moments so destabilizing was not only the act itself, but the sudden clarity that followed. They realized they had seen it coming. Somewhere within them there had always been a quiet knowing, a sense that something was off. But they had silenced it. They chose belief over evidence, potential over reality. They held on to who someone could be, instead of accepting who they were. And in that moment, the deeper wound surfaced, not just that they had been betrayed, but that they had abandoned themselves in the process. This realization carries a particular weight. The anger that emerges is not directed outward alone. It turns inward as well, toward the moments they ignored their instincts, toward the boundaries they chose not to set, toward the truth they felt but did not honor. What breaks in that moment is not the heart, but the illusion. Jung referred to this as the withdrawal of projections. The empath had been placing qualities, goodness, depth, sincerity, onto others, seeing not what was present but what was hoped for. When those projections fall away, reality appears without distortion, and what follows is not always dramatic. There is no collapse, no outward storm. Instead, there is stillness, a quiet that feels unfamiliar, a calm that unsettles others. The emotional intensity that once defined them no longer moves in the same way. They begin to see clearly, perhaps for the first time, without the filter of expectation or longing. Jung described this shift as one of the most striking transformations he encountered. The individual does not announce it. There is no need for explanation or display. They simply stop engaging in what once drained them. They no longer manage the emotional states of others. They no longer over-explain, justify, or soften themselves to maintain connection. The roles they once held begin to dissolve without ceremony. And this absence is felt. Families that depended on their mediation are left to confront their own tensions. Relationships that relied on their emotional labor begin to falter. Patterns that were once sustained by their effort start to collapse under their own weight. Nothing dramatic has been said, and yet everything has changed. Friends who once relied on them as constant emotional support began to encounter something unfamiliar: limits. Where there had once been endless availability, there were now clear boundaries. The empath had quietly withdrawn their energy from a system that had depended on their quiet overextension. What unsettled others most was not hostility. It was the absence of it. Anger would have been recognizable, something people knew how to respond to, something that could eventually be softened, redirected, or dissolved. But this was different. There was no emotional charge to negotiate with, no reaction to pull them back into old patterns, only a calm disengagement from dynamics that once held power over them. Attempts were made to restore the old version of them. Crises appeared suddenly. Guilt was invoked. Familiar emotional scripts were repeated. Yet nothing seemed to reach them in the same way. They observed rather than absorbed, noticing patterns with a quiet clarity that felt almost clinical. Carl Jung described this as a crucial psychological shift, the integration of what he called the shadow. Within every deeply sensitive person exists a part of the self that has often been rejected or suppressed, the part that prioritizes its own needs, the part that says no, the part that refuses to carry what does not belong to it. Many are taught to see this side as selfish or even wrong. Cultural values often glorify sacrifice, reinforcing the idea that giving endlessly is a measure of goodness. But Jung saw this differently. He understood that this hidden aspect was not a flaw, it was a form of protection, a natural counterbalance, a psychological safeguard against being consumed by the needs and expectations of others. When this part of the self is finally acknowledged and integrated, something changes, not into cruelty, but into wholeness. The individual no longer operates from one extreme. Compassion remains, but it is no longer automatic or indiscriminate. It becomes intentional, directed, chosen. They begin to recognize manipulation without feeling compelled to ignore it. They allow themselves to step back without guilt. They offer care, but only where there is mutual respect and genuine presence. This is not a loss of empathy. It is the refinement of it. Jung viewed this as a mature stage of psychological development, Not the removal of the ego, but the alignment of all parts of the self into conscious awareness. What was once unconscious and suppressed now becomes part of deliberate choice. For much of their life they had given to others without measure. Now they begin to extend that same attention inward, not as indulgence but as balance, not as rejection of others, but as recognition of their own limits. The shift is subtle but unmistakable. Where their presence once felt open to everyone, it now feels grounded, contained, not closed, but discerning. They no longer respond automatically to every demand placed upon them. Their energy is no longer something that spills outward without direction. To some this appears distant, to others it may even seem harsh, but in reality it is clarity taking form. They pause before responding. They no longer feel urgency to fix what is not theirs. Messages that once demanded immediate attention can wait. Calls that drain rather than connect are no longer answered out of obligation. And in this quiet selectivity, something new emerges. A self that is no longer defined by how much it can carry for others, but by how consciously it chooses where to stand. They began to say no, quietly, without justification, where once they would have said yes out of guilt. Invitations that drained them were declined. Gatherings that left them unsettled were no longer attended. Relationships that had always required more from them than they ever received were allowed to end. They stepped away from people they had spent years trying to help, not out of bitterness but out of clarity. What others often misunderstood was this: they had not lost their capacity to care. They had simply stopped caring in ways that required them to abandon themselves. They no longer invested in being liked by those who never truly saw them. They no longer held together environments that depended on their silent endurance. The need to preserve harmony at their own expense dissolved. In its place came something steadier: self-respect. Carl Jung emphasized a truth that many resist until experience forces it into awareness. Genuine care for others cannot exist without a foundation of respect for oneself. Not surface-level affirmations, but a deeper refusal to participate in one's own erosion. This shift began to show in every area of their life. At work, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The person who once carried everyone's emotional weight no longer stepped into that role. They still performed their responsibilities with precision, but they no longer absorbed stress that wasn't theirs. They stopped compensating for others' lack of boundaries. Conversations that once pulled them into unnecessary tension were met with calm distance. They remained courteous, but no longer accessible to manipulation. The environment around them adjusted, sometimes uneasily, because a role had disappeared. What had once been quietly relied upon was no longer available. Within family systems, the transformation ran deeper. They stopped mediating conflicts that were never theirs to resolve. They no longer positioned themselves as the emotional anchor for everyone else. Without confrontation or explanation, they stepped out of roles that had been assigned to them long before they were aware of it. Reactions followed. Questions, accusations, confusion. Words like selfish surfaced. Remarks about how they had changed were repeated, often with discomfort beneath them. And in a sense, those observations were accurate. They had changed. Not into someone cold, but into someone who no longer measured love by how much they could endure. They began to engage differently, present, but not entangled, caring, but not consumed. They could remain connected without losing themselves in the process. Where necessary, they spoke simply, "This does not work for me," without elaboration, without apology. In close relationships, the shift became even more visible. Dynamics that once relied on their tolerance no longer held. Patterns that had been overlooked were now seen clearly, and once seen, they could not be ignored again. Instead of explaining their pain repeatedly, they responded with action. Distance replaced discussion when boundaries were crossed. Some relationships adapted. When met with this new clarity, certain people recognized what had been taken for granted. They adjusted, meeting the empath with a level of responsibility and respect that had been missing before. These connections deepened, not through sacrifice but through balance. Others could not. They were drawn to the version of the empath who had required little and given everything. When that version was no longer present, the connection lost its foundation. Attempts to return to old patterns failed, and eventually they left. This time, the departure did not carry the same weight. It was not experienced as loss, but as alignment. Jung noted that this stage often unsettles the surrounding environment, not because the individual becomes harsh, but because their absence reveals what had long been hidden. Patterns once stabilized by their presence begin to surface. Tensions that were quietly managed become visible. The empath had not created that dysfunction. They had simply stopped concealing it, and in that withdrawal, something essential becomes clear. Their value was never in how much they could carry for others, but in the awareness they bring when they finally choose not to carry it anymore. When the empath steps back, what once appeared stable begins to unravel. Family structures lose their fragile balance. Friendships that felt meaningful reveal a quiet dependency. Work environments that seemed efficient grow tense without the unseen effort that once held everything together. What others begin to realize, often too late, is how much had been quietly sustained for them. But by this stage, the empath is no longer waiting for recognition. This is not revenge, this is autonomy. Carl Jung described this state as a kind of psychological invulnerability. Not because pain disappears, but because awareness has deepened. The empath still perceives what others feel. They still notice subtle emotional shifts, unspoken tensions, underlying motives. But these perceptions no longer dictate their behavior. They have moved from being controlled by their sensitivity to directing it consciously. And with that shift, something remarkable happens. They begin to see patterns instantly, not with suspicion, but with clarity. They recognize when affection is exaggerated, when promises are hollow, when communication is distorted. What once took months or years to understand now becomes visible almost immediately. Their awareness acts as a quiet filter, guiding them without effort. Yet they do not use this clarity to harm. They could. They understand people deeply enough to expose weaknesses, to dismantle facades, to respond with precision. But that impulse fades, not out of restraint alone, but out of disinterest. There is no longer a need to prove, to retaliate, or to correct. They simply step away. Jung found this restraint significant, not because action was expected, but because it revealed a different kind of strength. The absence of reaction was not passivity, it was choice. This creates a subtle but powerful effect on those around them. Their presence becomes revealing. Without confrontation, without accusation, others begin to feel seen. Those who rely on manipulation often grow uncomfortable, not because anything is said, but because nothing can be taken. There is no emotional entry point, no leverage. At the same time, those who are genuine respond differently. They feel at ease. There is no need to perform, no need to defend. The connection becomes simple, direct, and unforced. In this way, the empath's world begins to reorganize itself. Without effort, without strategy, their environment shifts. Certain people drift away, others move closer. What remains is not built on obligation, but on alignment. From here, life is rebuilt, not dramatically, but intentionally. Work becomes something that respects their nature rather than drains it. Some choose paths where their insight can be used without depletion. Others seek quieter environments where their energy is not constantly pulled outward. The common thread is not the role itself, but the awareness behind it. Relationships follow the same pattern. Friendships are no longer based on who needs them most, but on mutual presence. Support flows both ways. There is space, respect, and honesty. Nothing needs to be forced. Romantic connections transform even more deeply. They are no longer entered from a place of fixing or saving. Instead, they emerge from wholeness. The empath no longer searches for someone to heal, but for someone who stands on equal ground. Someone who understands that care does not require sacrifice of self. And so, everything becomes more deliberate. Their home becomes a place of restoration, not obligation. Their time is no longer endlessly available. Their energy is no longer something to be distributed without thought. What was once given freely is now given meaningfully. They begin to understand something essential. Protecting their peace is not selfish, it is necessary. The moment they stopped maintaining dysfunctional harmony was the moment they began cultivating something real within themselves, not withdrawal from life, but a return to it, on their own terms. Jung saw this as the emergence of a sovereign individual, someone who has moved through unconscious patterns, through disillusionment, through the integration of their denied self, and arrived at conscious choice. They no longer react automatically. They respond deliberately. They have not lost their capacity to feel. They have gained the ability to choose how that feeling is expressed. They have not become distant. They have become clear. They have not stopped loving. They have learned to include themselves in that love. This is not an endpoint, but a foundation. Their sensitivity remains, intact, even refined. But now it is held with awareness. Their energy is no longer something to be taken, but something to be respected. Their peace is no longer negotiable. And those who cannot meet them there simply do not remain. This is not harshness. It is clarity. The world often expects those who feel deeply to give endlessly. But what it truly needs are those who can feel deeply without losing themselves, who can care without dissolving, who can see clearly without becoming hardened. This transformation is not a loss. It is a return, not to who they were before the world shaped them, but to who they were beneath it all. The moment they stopped caring in the old way was not the end of their story. It was the moment they began to live it consciously.